gonna do your intro.
Yes.
And then we'll get you ready, Shirley? You ready?
Yes.
Ready to wow us?
Alrighty, so this is our speaker. Trent Davis is the lab manager of the Brain Bridge Psychology Lab and a recent Chicago graduate who double majored in neuroscience and visual arts. Over the last several years, he has led a project studying the relationship between memory and art.
Okay, so that's me. Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. I know that I'm the last talk of the series, so thank you for being here instead of out doing other nice stuff in the sun. But yeah, so I basically just want this to be a pretty informal talk. If you have any questions, like feel free to interrupt me. And yeah, just let me know. Hopefully enjoy yourselves and learn a thing or two.
It's actually too hot outside for that.
That's true. It was I was getting a little gross walking over here. It wasn't fun, but okay, so cool. So broadly speaking, my research looks at what can art teach us about memory. So just a little bit more about me. Like you said, I double majored in neuroscience and visual arts. These are some fun little pictures from my art exhibition that I had at the end of my senior year. In my art as well as my research, I try to bring both like neuroscience and art themes together, so you can see the dissection pins. And this one in the bottom left, my cursor's being weird, is about like all the different ways you could be medically declared dead, because I hated when all the art people would be like death. But anyway, that's some of my art stuff. I also ran the Neuro Club at Chicago. So we worked with a lot of brains, a lot of dissections and cool stuff. I imagine you guys have something similar. But yeah, so that was a big part of my undergrad, as well as the Brain Bridge Lab, which I've been a part of for over 3 years now, beginning of my sophomore year, and now I'm the lab manager. So they've kind of been there through it all. So yeah, basically this talk is going to be broken up into 3 different projects. The first is going to be work that I did at the Art Institute of Chicago. The second is a project looking at how memorability develops and changes over time. And the last one is an art contest that we ran most recently, which literally I took down the gallery like a week and a half ago, and I'm currently shipping out all the artworks back to the artists. So that's like very, very recent stuff. But yeah, so first let's talk about the project at the Art Institute. So first, it's important to establish like what is memorability. I forget if you guys read the paper or not, but if you're familiar, just bear with me. But yeah, so memorability is an intrinsic property of an image. It's not like our individual memories, which can vary and are often very subjective, but about how well the stimulus or the object is remembered across a population of people. Because of that, memorability describes the degree to which an image is remembered or forgotten, and it's also inconsistent across viewers. Really importantly, memorability is independent of attentional state, motivation, and personal preference. So again, in the grand scheme of things, you don't matter. It's just about the object itself, right? Memorability has been shown to be present for faces, naturalistic scenes, so like a classroom, something like that, and even things as dynamic as dance moves and now voices as well. So we're kind of discovering it pretty much everywhere we look, and that's been really cool seeing all the different projects going on in the lab. Memorability, at least for images, is calculated by a corrective recognition score. Some people use things called D prime and others, but this is how we do it generally. And it's just the hit rate minus the false alarm rate. And so, for example, this painting is called Syrian Goats by John Singer Sargent. It's one of my favorite paintings in the Art Institute. And it has a hit rate of 0.51 and a false alarm rate of 0.05, giving it an unfortunately very low memorability score of just 0.46, which is less than chance, even though it's one of my favorites. But broadly speaking, that's how memorability works here. So why artwork, besides me just liking art? As we know, art is highly subjective. You know, you can see The Drinkers by Van Gogh and love it, and it's your favorite painting, whereas I only see the little like gremlin guy in the corner drinking the milk. So yeah, art is highly subjective and it's dependent on interpretation. There's a wide array of styles ranging from Van Gogh's kind of swoopy brushstrokes to hyperrealism and completely abstract. So there's a whole range of things. And also there's an intention behind the work. As opposed to a picture of a naturalistic scene, you know, someone making an artwork may actually want you to remember it or want you to come away with a specific message. So that's kind of what makes it unique as opposed to other visual stimuli, which is what at least I'm really interested in. So because of that, our questions were, is memorability even applicable to something as subjective as art? And what makes a work of art memorable? Lastly, is there any relationship between the memorability of an artwork and how famous or successful it becomes? So in order to determine the memorability scores, we ran an online test called the Continuous Recognition Task. We had over 3,000 participants because we were looking at the memorability of over 4,000 paintings from the Art Institute. It's basically every single acrylic, oil, watercolor, gouache, whole list of paintings. And this is the structure of the task. So basically participants just see a continuous stream of images. They see them for a little over a second, and they're instructed to press an R key for whenever they see an image that's been repeated. From that, we can tell the hit rate and the false alarm rate, which lets us know the memorability score. And so, really importantly, we saw that participants did significantly remember and forget the same images, meaning that what we're seeing here and the scores that we're getting are actually the memorability scores and not just some artifact of how much they like the piece or something other random. So yeah, that was really exciting to see that memorability is applicable to artwork. So now let's look at the ones, yeah, go ahead.
When you run like an online experiment like that, do you ever have problems because, like, I don't know, just with online stuff in general, like I'm thinking of like online classes, like do you ever have problems with people just kind of like, I don't know, not really paying attention?
Oh,
not putting the
absolutely.
full effort
Yeah,
into
so
it?
in all of these, we have like attention checks baked in. So like I said, for the target images, it's a 30-second minimum delay, but occasionally we'll have one where it's like a back-to-back image, and we'll have those spread throughout. And so if they're failing those attention checks frequently enough, we just kick them out and don't use their data. So there definitely are people who just like, you know, or just some people who don't bother pressing at all, but we have a bunch of ways that we can filter them out. Good question though. Yeah, so now these are the artworks with the highest memorability. First, we have Toreador by Francis Picabia, which had a memorability score of 0.952. Torsos Rot by Kate Rosen, which is just under at 0.95. And the last one is called Cutty Sark, and I forget the artist's name. But these all had very high memorability scores, which means that basically 95% of people are going to remember seeing this image. As you can see, most of these have pretty clear subject matter. It's not really difficult to figure out what you're supposed to be looking at. And we find that a lot of these really highly memorable artworks have a lot of, they're very rich in semantic content, which is backed up by some other research by Max Kramer, who was a former master's student in the lab. He uses this thing called the Things database. And basically it's a visual data set of everything. So it'll have like dogs, apricots, airplanes, iced coffee. It'll have everything. And basically they looked at the memorability of almost everything. And again, there, as well as in my research, they see that that semantic content really drives memorability as opposed to more low-level features like, for example, color. And then these are the least memorable artworks. This one, I forget the name of it, ironically, and this one as well. So these have really, really low memorability scores. And here, it's not just a matter of like performing at chance even, because chance performance is like about 50%. But here, being so low as like 0.2, they have to have that combination of just really not being memorable, but also having a higher false alarm rate. So where you confuse it with other paintings, because again, memorability is that hit rate minus that false alarm rate. So these are both very forgettable and easily confused with other images. And again, here, unlike the memorable images, there's not really anything you can latch onto. There's not a lot of semantic content. If I asked you to describe it, your first word would probably be like, you know. So that's kind of how these forgettable paintings tend to be. And also, let's look at the highest false alarm rate paintings. Both of these, not surprisingly, are just very boring beige landscapes, where if you saw 50 of these, you'd probably have a really hard time distinguishing between them. So again, these paintings that have high false alarm rates also tend to have pretty low memorability scores. And now let's talk about ResMem. ResMem is a super fancy deep learning neural network that was developed by a former master's student in our lab named Cohen Needell. I couldn't tell you how it works because it has like 152 layers. It uses like low level and semantic content and somehow all puts that out into a final memorability score. But basically, it looks at everything in an image, but it only has the image itself. It knows nothing about cultural context. If I showed it, Van Gogh, it would have no idea who Van Gogh is. It just sees the pixels on the screen. And despite having only that information, ResMan was able to significantly predict memorability for artwork online. And it did it really well too. And so that gave us confidence to kind of use it later on as a tool in some of our other studies. And it was just another way that we validated ResMan. Because it actually wasn't trained on anything like an artwork. It was trained on a set of 70,000 images of real world scenes and just pictures of objects against a white background. And so again, artworks aren't really present in there, but it was still able to do really well, which is cool. And yeah, so one of my biggest priorities is taking the research out of the lab, because what's the point of doing research about artwork if you're just sitting at a computer, which is not where most people see artwork. You see it at a museum like the Art Institute. So we did an in-person memorability test where we looked at just the American art wing of the museum, because if you've been there, that place is enormous. I could spend like literally several days there without leaving. So we just limited to this really small and like pretty isolated part of the museum where they're not interacting with too much other artwork, they're just seeing the stuff that's there. We did a mobile Qualtrics survey, so they just took it on their phones. And basically, for this type of survey, we have the target images, which are the ones that are in the gallery, but also we have foil images, so like fake out images, basically. All of these foil images were from the same time period, many were by the same artist, and they were all in the same region. So they were all American art from like 18 whatever to 19 whatever, so that participants weren't like picking up on something like a difference in style, but they were actually remembering or forgetting the pieces. So this is the survey. It's very simple. Just, did you see the painting? And you range from definitely not to definitely yes. And we also had a little option if you were familiar with the painting or if you had seen it before. But that was very rare. We picked people who hadn't been to the Art Institute in at least 6 months, and most of them had either never been there or it had been like several years since they had gone. And we had 20 participants going through. Lastly, we really wanted this to be a naturalistic experience. If people came with their friends, they could walk around with their friends, talk about the pieces, take pictures. Literally, the only instructions that they were given were try to look at every artwork, and when you take the test, get out of there, because we didn't want them to see any of the images that were on their phone. So yeah, just like a normal museum visit, because if we controlled it too much, it would almost make the results pointless. So having this experiment in person allowed us to look at in-person factors that you can't really capture on a computer screen, like size. And even if we did vary, the size of an image on the screen, there's a big difference between seeing something like this that's really 6 feet tall in person. So we were able to look at size and how the size of one piece interacted with the size of its neighbors. Kind of intuitively, I guess that, a bigger painting is, the more memorable it's going to be. But if you have a really small painting next to a much bigger painting, at least what I thought is that, the memorability of the smaller one would kind of get washed out and you would just get distracted by that really big one. We saw that size did positively correlate with memorability, but that it was actually the opposite of my intuition for how the size of one piece interacts with another. So if you have a small piece, it actually gets a really big boost in memorability when it's placed next to a larger one. So that's just one example of how these results can directly translate into the real world. For example, like a curator could learn this and stagger the size of your pieces to help your viewers remember it. So this is just one way in person we're able to kind of capture those influences that online you have no idea about. We also looked at location. So again, the American Art Wing is 2 floors. And here is just a heat map of the average memorability of the paintings in each room. You can kind of see that there's like some weird outliers here, but broadly speaking, most of the rooms hang out around the middle. But importantly, the first floor had 94 paintings and the second floor only had 68. And so when we had participants go through, they took a survey after each floor. And so we wondered if that difference in number, having one much higher than the other, would actually influence their memory. And it did. We saw that participants remembered significantly more artworks on the second floor than on the first floor. So again, not surprisingly, the more artworks that you have, the harder it is to remember them. Yeah.
Did you see like if it depended on which floor they started on?
So we split it up. So we had like 20 participants and we basically had 10 start on the first floor and then go to the second, and 10 start on the second and go to the first. So broadly speaking, that shouldn't have influenced it. But I believe even when we looked at like the order, the second floor was still better no matter where they started. And again, that was partially mitigated by, they went through a floor and then took the survey, as opposed to like going through one, going through two, and then just taking all the surveys. But yeah, great question. But yeah, so that's like one kind of location and size effect that we saw, but we wanted to get a bit more fine grained than that. Bless you. So these paintings are the Chicago panels by Ellsworth Kelly. They're like these really huge, just weird abstract panels that are exactly what you see as just a color on the wall. And online, these paintings had about average memorability score of like 0.77. And you might expect to be the same in person. However, we saw that in person they had a score of just 0.39, which is a pretty drastic decrease. So we were like, okay, what's going on here? Why are these really big, really bright, colorful paintings being completely forgotten? And so these are where the paintings are in person. They are not in kind of the other gallery sections where the other artworks are, but rather in this big open air space that you wouldn't necessarily expect art to be. And so one big thing that I guess related it to was the doorway effect, where if you like walk through a door, you're like, okay, what did I come in my room for? Do I need my keys or what? And so we think there's a possible link to a doorway effect here of going from a series of gallery rooms to another, and you're just kind of blanking out at the space in between. And so you can see the Chicago panels right here in room 261, which was had the second lowest average memorability score. So that's just another way that we can use these in-person factors to learn more about what makes a painting memorable or forgettable. Yeah.
Do you remember what was in room 176?
I went back and looked, and it was just like, it wasn't anything special. I think it was just this random thing of like, it just happened to be a bunch of really forgettable ones. The first floor has, unfortunately, we couldn't control the gallery. Obviously, the first floor has a bunch of furniture as well as artwork up on the wall because it's like old antique furniture that they're including as part of the exhibit. So it could be that having that there in addition to the artworks kind of distracted you and prevented you from remembering the artworks as well. But that was for the whole floor. So it's unclear why room 176 in particular would be so bad.
Room 176.
But yeah, so I'm not quite sure, but we did go back and look and it was just, I don't know, just kind of random. But yeah, cool. And then our last experiment for the Art Institute study, we wanted to look at the subjective qualities. So I'm going to do a little call for the room here. What subjective qualities do you think would possibly make you remember a piece? Emotion?
Faces.
Faces?
Figures.
Disgusting things.
Disgusting things, so like a guttural reaction, right?
I was gonna say, I feel like sometimes for me, it's like associations to past memories.
Okay,
So
cool.
like if I'm looking at something and it just seems like very strongly familiar to something
Yeah.
that I experienced in the past, it's almost like instant for me.
Okay,
So it's just an association. It's not really like,
gotcha.
but yeah, that.
So like emotion, disgust, familiarity, right, for those subjective qualities. So we looked at beauty, emotion, interest, and familiarity. These are the four that we looked at because, again, these are the people that people say most. It's not surprising, like, oh, it was so beautiful, I cried, whatever. And so we wanted to see if these actually did impact the memorability of a piece. So this was the survey that a separate pool of participants were given. Again, just very straightforward questioning of how beautiful, what type of emotions did you feel, how interested were you, and how familiar is the piece. So any guesses as to which related to memorability?
Interesting.
Interest? Backing out on your familiarity answer?
No, it's just he seems a little boring to me.
Well, just the pieces as a whole, not the piece. You're right, the piece is boring.
It's just when I look at it, I'm like, what is this?
Okay. Well, we found that the only one that was related to memorability was interestingness. So the more interesting a painting was, the better remembered it was. So beauty, emotion, familiarity, much to our surprise, we found that those really didn't have any impact, which was very weird to see. And this was the most interesting painting. Do you agree?
It's also in your paper.
Oh, anyway.
So.
I've
Kidding.
seen that book before.
But anyway, so this is the conflagration of the Masonic Hall, and people thought it was really interesting. The colors here aren't really captured very well. It's a lot like redder in person. It shows up more like pink.
What is it, a burning church?
I think so, yeah. That's back when they were still burning stuff, but yeah. But yeah, that was the most interesting painting in person. And yeah, so how well can we predict real world memory? When we bring all these factors together, like what floor a painting was on, its size, its neighbors, how interesting it was, as well as its ResMem score, as well as some other factors included in there as well, we're actually able to build a linear model that accounts for 53% of the variance of in-person memory, which is really cool to see because a lot of previous memorability research caps out around like 45 to 50%, but we were able to kind of boost it up and really predict people's memory in person. So again, this just points to more applications to the real world for artists, for curators, and anyone who's interested in making something remembered, showing that you can actually do it in the real world, not just online.
But does memorability, I mean, in this context, then like, if there's not, if it's not a good indicator for kind of the like subjective quality of an art piece, then like what's the ultimate, like, so if you were trying to put together the space and you're putting works kind of based on like a resonance score or something, or based on something that would, if that doesn't translate into like a subjective kind of analysis or valuation of that work, then like what's the utility? So if that space is more memorable, does that translate into it actually being like a greater positive experience, or that people are doing this art in a way that's going to enhance their like experience?
That's a good question. I guess for us, it really is just about like making the space more memorable. So if you're an artist who like wants to send out a particular message, maybe like a Barbara Kruger type that just uses like text or something, that's really a place where it's applicable. But it's interesting to see memorability be brought into these different areas, like marketing especially. A lot of companies are really interested in it, but we've shown in other studies that the memorability of a piece doesn't actually dictate whether or not, like how likely you are to buy it. Like you'll remember it, but that doesn't necessarily influence your decision making. So here it's really just trying to make those artworks in the gallery stick in your brain, and artwork is subjective. You do with that what you want. But yeah, so that's kind of the limit of our scope in this capacity. But yeah. And I think, okay, last point about the Art Institute data. A big question we had was about famous paintings, like kind of like a chicken or the egg question. Does a painting become famous because it's intrinsically memorable, or is it intrinsically memorable because it was already famous? For example, like Starry Night. I'm sure you can all see Starry Night in your head right now, but do you remember it just because you've seen it a billion times and know it's famous, or is it something else? So to answer this, we use ResMem. Like I said before, ResMem knows nothing about cultural context and just sees the image. And so we used it for paintings like Self-Portrait by Vincent van Gogh, Mao by Andy Warhol, and American Gothic, I forget the artist. But we used it on all these paintings that were marked as boosted by the Art Institute of Chicago, basically ones that their curators say are famous. And we saw that boosted paintings had a significantly higher memorability score than non-boosted paintings. So this points to the fact that these paintings could have become famous because they are intrinsically memorable, not the other way around.
I don't even remember the painting that was there.
You never seen Mao?
Oh, there you go.
I love it. It's in person. It's enormous too. Like it literally is like probably bigger than floor to ceiling. So it's very weird seeing it in person. But yeah, so famous paintings are significantly more memorable. So kind of just wrapping up this first bit, we showed that memory for artworks are consistent and predictable. Size and location impact memorability. There's a very variable influence of subjective qualities, and famous paintings are more memorable. So any questions on that stuff before I move on? Yeah.
Why didn't you guys look at sculptures or ceramics?
Because we didn't know how to. Kind of going back in the presentation, we use that continuous recognition task to get the memorability scores. And so it's a really big question of how do you capture the memorability of an object?
So like, yeah.
Like, you can look at this bottle from this way, there's no stickers, but here I'm looking straight at the Star Wars one, you know, and so it's really hard. The only way I would imagine doing it is like having a VR setup where you let someone like drag it around and see the whole thing and then move on to the next.
I also think,
Yeah.
you know, when you're looking at shoes online and you can like kind of like spin it.
Yeah.
Do it like that.
Yeah, for sure. But then it's also a matter of like participant engagement, like you
Like how
asked
much-
earlier, someone could just like, you know, wiggle it and move on versus actually take their time to view it. So I think almost like a video format would be good as well, like having it rotate and then moving on. But for this study, we just limited it to just those pictures. But that's a completely like valid avenue to go down to look at like sculptures, 3D objects, and that could, even like paintings, you know, a lot of them have work on the side of the canvas that you're not really capturing with this forward center view. But yeah, definitely true.
So, so like these were paintings that were looked at in person.
Mhm.
Would it be different if it was like a digital picture, like an actual picture taken from the phone and not produced by paint?
So every artwork that we looked at in person was also in the online study. And they, if I'm remembering correctly, there was a very positive correlation between their online score and their in-person score. There were those factors like size and everything that did play an influence, but broadly speaking, their baseline memorability was about the same. Cool. So moving on to our memorability over time study. So in this project, we really wanted to look at how the artwork creation process influenced an image's memorability. So which artistic decisions drive changes in memorability? And how does an image's memorability even develop over time? Does it start super memorable and stay that way, or vice versa, or is it just something different entirely? So when I talk about memorability over time, I'm talking about something like this. We got 50 videos that we collected online that were time lapses of people making artworks, and we collected screenshots, about 50 from each of those videos. And then we use ResMem to get the memorability score of all of these artworks, because again, we showed that ResMem in our previous study was able to do that really well. So again, you go from like pretty much the absolute start to the absolute end. And this very chaotic and ugly chart is how the memorability scores of all the artworks changed over time. So you can see them at the starting point here and the end point here. But to kind of make sense of it a bit more, we arbitrarily split it into high and low memorability groups. So you can see that they actually start at around the same point, but then diverge later on. So this points to the fact that it's like changes that actively happen over time that lead to an image's memorability, and that is not just locked in from the start. This is an example painting showing that there's a lot of variation as well, you know, starting off super low and then ending up super high in this kind of very active process. Importantly, we looked at 3 distinct stages in the artworks, and this was done for like analysis later on just to make things a bit easier. But we looked at start images, which again are the very start, end images, but we also looked at a spot in between at the composition stage. So the composition stage isn't necessarily like the dead center of the creation process, but it's the point at which like everything in the final image is basically there, but it's just not fully fleshed out yet. And so one of the first things we did was backtrack. We took the image's final memorability scores and split it into 4 quartiles, and then looked back in time to again look at where these paintings started. And like I showed in that first graph or second graph, we really see that paintings start off at around the same memorability. And then we see that they begin to diverge at the composition stage and then really finish out at the final memorability. So it is a very slow and very gradual process to emerge at this final point. We also looked at all the different changes that happened throughout. So we had 2 artists work together and literally click through all 2,500 changes that happened to every single one of the artworks and categorize them as either sketching, blocking, or details. Sketching and details are pretty self-explanatory, but blocking is basically just filling in. And so they had to agree on every single one of those labels. We saw that blocking had the greatest change, or produced the greatest change in memorability on average, and it was also the most frequent type of change. So blocking here is really a driver of changes in memorability, as opposed to details, which unfortunately doesn't do much. Not surprisingly, because, pretty hard to tell the difference between these two. And yeah, sketching and blocking produce significantly greater changes than details. We also looked at spatial properties. So this kind of weird image is actually a difference image. So if you have images 1 through 50, this is, for example, image 35 minus image 34. You're literally subtracting the pixels to see the differences between them. And so this is just one example. We took all these difference images and kind of squared them off to make them standardized because, the artworks were in all different shapes and sizes. And we converted them to a binary mask to see exactly where the pixels are changing. That allowed us to make this heat map, which showed us where all the changes in the artworks are done, basically. Where yellow is an area of greater intensity of change and kind of blue is not much changes going on. And so you can see here that it kind of follows this like foreground, middle ground, and subject, and just like background and sky format, where not surprisingly, most of the changes are happening in the middle, a little less towards the bottom, and then even less so at the very top of the image. Going back to the mask, we then, if you can see the little blue asterisks here, they're basically the center point of every area where there's a difference. We took those center points and found the center of those center points, which is basically the center of all of the changes in a single transition from one image to another. Using those center points, we were able to see in this very weird heat map, basically that changes that are focused in the more center of an image produce on average a greater change in memorability. Yeah.
Does changing the composition of the artwork by making it a square in any way like affect the memorability or like the visual interest of it?
I'm sure it did. That's a good point. For here, we're just like, that's the only way we could look at
Yeah.
location. We thought about like matching up landscape versus portrait images, but then again, at like when you're looking at the pixel level, even if one image is a single pixel like narrower than the other, that messes up the whole thing because then you're missing a ton.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right that that'll create a change. This was just the only way that we could think to do it.
Yeah, makes sense.
But yeah, center focus changes, not surprisingly, produce the greatest change in memorability. Some other findings that we have from the study, we looked at tons of different visual features. The previous study showed that visual features and low-level ones don't have the greatest impact, but I'm very stubborn, and I wanted to see if there was anything. Unfortunately, clutter was the only impact on memorability. So the more cluttered an image was, the less memorable it was. We also looked at color. Again, previous studies have shown that color doesn't have a great impact on memorability. And I dug and I dug and I dug, and I really wanted to see if there was something. There was not. I was very sad, and this has been an ongoing debate between me and my PI, and I refuse to give up. But yeah, so no impact of color. And the last thing is that there was a positive correlation between the number of pixels that changed and the change in memorability. So not surprisingly, the more you change in the image, the more the memorability will change. And the last thing we did was a ResMem validation. Because these were using ResMem scores, a lot of people were like, oh, well, what about humans? Even though we've repeatedly shown that ResMem works. But we did it anyway using our start composition and final image friends. And we saw that for each stage, ResMem was able to significantly predict memorability. It definitely had a harder time when you go back to the start here, because again, these are very weird images that it wasn't trained on anything remotely close to this. So it wasn't surprising that it had a bit of a harder time, but it still was able to significantly predict memorability in all three stages, which kind of gave us the confidence to show this work. Yeah.
I know you've been saying that like color doesn't have an impact potentially. But would it be good to have like the blocking in between the composition and final, just because there is such a drastic change between the composition and final?
So generally speaking, the like order of the changes went from like sketching to blocking to details, but that doesn't mean that that was like the strict order of things that happened.
Yeah.
So it can go like sketching, blocking details, and just go all over the place. Sketching was definitely a lot more towards the start, but blocking did kind of drive that change in memorability from the composition to the final stage.
Okay.
I don't know if that answered the question well.
I'm just saying like adding like a fourth like step in this validation with the blocking, since you also had it in like the human ones, if I believe, if you were looking at like the sketching and blocking and then like detail.
So those are just human, those are just artists that were describing the changes that
Oh,
happened.
okay.
So they were just basically labeling. They didn't have anything to do with like figuring out memorability or
Okay,
anything like that.
okay.
Yeah, this is a completely different set of like 200 something people that did the continued recognition task and let us get the memorability from it.
Okay.
And yeah, so the summary of this is that artistic decisions guide changes in memorability. Changes between groups emerge at the composition stage. Center focus changes and blocking impact memorability the most. And color and visual features have very little impact. Any questions about this study? There's one more. Yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah, this was kind of like the forgotten middle child as the art contest got along. So excited to talk about that next. So yeah, the art contest. Why did we even run it in the first place? It was inspired by the finding that famous artworks were more memorable. So if artists can intentionally create a memorable artwork, could that predict their success? We also wanted to see if this would work because broadly speaking, people are actually pretty bad at predicting whether or not an image will be memorable or forgettable. And so rather than take my word for it, I'm going to test you guys. So you're going to see two images. I'm going to ask you if the left or right is more memorable. Just raise your hand for whichever you think it is. So out of these two, which do you think will be more memorable? Raise your hand for the left
It's so chaotic looking.
and the right.
Right.
Okay, so about 50-50. Next. Raise your hand if you think the left will be more memorable. Okay, and the right, no one? Okay, cool. And last. Indeed.
Dang it.
It's a big Raise your hand if you think the left will be more memorable. And the right. Okay, so again about oak, you didn't give your answer.
Right, what you doing?
No one gets a cop out here, you
I
know.
Minus one. Like if you close your eyes right now, what would you remember?
Maybe the left.
Okay, so the left. So again, still 50-50. So these three paintings on the left were among the 20 most memorable for the contest, and these were the 20 most forgettable in the contest.
Wait, what?
So these were among the 20 most forgettable, and these were among the 20 most memorable. So hopefully I think I successfully tricked you guys. I think.
3 for
3
3.
for 3? Okay.
Great.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Good job, good job. But yeah, so again, this is just going to show that like people are pretty bad at predicting memorability.
Not Josh though.
Not Josh or Oak.
Yeah.
But yeah, so basically in the art contest, we wanted to see, can artists create intentionally memorable and forgettable artwork? And what is responsible for an artist's success in the contest? If they are successful, is it their education, their background, their style, what is it? So basically, we wanted to keep the art contest kind of like our studies as open as possible. We did have to limit it to 2D artwork, and we didn't include photography or digital work because that kind of opened the door for people to use AI and cheat, and we didn't want any of that nonsense. We did ask that they submit 5 progress pictures kind of to support our second study, but also to prevent people from cheating. They had to be based in the US just for shipping reasons, at a max size of 3 by 3 feet for, showing it in the gallery. We can't have like a 10-foot piece. Last, they could only submit to one category, so they had to choose whether they wanted their work to be memorable or forgettable. We had some pretty decent prizes for the artists, and there was like no entry fee or anything. We covered the shipping, so we really wanted to encourage people to really do their best, try to create memorable or forgettable pieces. And kind of the submissions that came in, there were 86 valid entries. I learned that people just don't either know how to read or choose not to read, which was very frustrating, answering tons of emails about it. But we had 86 valid entries, which I was very happy about. 62 were memorable and 24 were for the forgettable category. And so a lot of people ask, like, why would an artist want to create a forgettable piece? Well, most of them don't. So that was interesting. We had 60 females, 22 males, and 4 who identified as neither. So a lot more females entered the contest. But we had a really wide range of educational backgrounds. So like people with MFAs versus people who were self-taught, and basically everything in between, which I was really happy about. And the last thing, we asked artists whether or not they identified as a professional artist, an amateur artist, or somewhere in between. And we had a pretty decent split, again, which I was happy to see because I hate the like label of a professional artist. I think it's nonsense. But we had a pretty good distribution of people applying to the contest as a whole. So now let's look at the most memorable work. These two paintings were tied for first place with perfect memorability scores. So in the continuous recognition test, they're shown to at least 40 people. And so these ones are basically 40 out of 40. Everybody remember them and no one mistook them for another work. And again, kind of similar to that online study, you have a very clear subject matter and it's kind of not going to be confused for anything else. This was third place, and we had another tie for fourth and fifth place for the most memorable artworks. What was cool is that there was also a wide range of media. We had like oil, acrylic. Here we have a collage on the left, so a lot of different types of entries. And then moving on to the most forgettable, we have the most forgettable piece with a memorability score just above chance and a very, very close second place, which determined that kind of $500 difference, just 0.001. So these were the two most forgettable pieces. I would be very upset. And here we have third place, fourth place, and fifth place. Kind of trending with the other artworks that we saw from the Art Institute study. It's a bit harder to tell what's going on in these pieces. There's a lot of different things competing for your attention, and there's not like a single subject matter with semantic value. So it was cool to see that it followed those same trends.
So would you say like ambiguity has something to do with memorability?
For sure, ambiguity, a variety of subject matter. I also think it would be cool to look at like how the different grounds of an image interact. So like if there's a clear difference between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, because all of these are pretty like, they're pretty flat, where it's hard to tell except for like maybe the background over here and over here. But it's just a lot of like kind of mixing in dimension and it's hard to tease it apart. Yeah.
Question, were any of the pieces that were submitted into the like memorable category or actually forgettable?
Yeah, so we had some people who were upset because they were like, I wanted it to be memorable. How am I like 10th most forgettable? And I'm like, that's on you. Like I have no control over
Sounds
this.
like a personal problem.
Exactly. So
Y'all
that
is so rude.
yeah.
Why do people?
But that happened a lot actually, especially for people trying to be memorable, ended up being forgettable. But oops. The top 5 in each, at least, were just submitted to that contest. So it wasn't like, you tried to make it memorable and you were the most forgettable. So nothing too crazy, but yeah, there was a lot of kind of in between. And so as for our results, first and foremost, we saw that people were consistent in the images they remembered and forgot, which let us know basically we are looking at memorability here. We're not just looking at some random artifact. And kind of the biggest finding is that memorable submissions were significantly more memorable than people who submitted to the forgettable contest. So this means that, yes, artists actually are able to make memorable and forgettable artwork based on their intuition, which again is weird because our previous studies showed that people are pretty bad at it. So that was our like kind of big finding there. Education level had no impact on an artist's success. So whether you had an MFA or you're an amateur artist who just picked up a pencil, didn't matter. And professional artists were actually less successful in the contest, which made me laugh a ton. So those snobs can enjoy themselves. And the last thing is that Resmem was able to significantly predict memorability here again. And kind of the next step was bringing these pieces from the computer, again, to the real world. So we rented out a gallery on 53rd Street near the school, and we put up the show. We had our like big artist statement and everything, so really just trying to make this like a traditional gallery as much as we can, but also explaining to people that this is an experiment. We had like QR codes throughout the gallery for people to test their memory. And the gallery actually used to be a Lululemon. So there are changing booths in the back that were actually our little testing booths. So people would scan the QR code, go in the testing booth, close the curtains, and test their memories. The way we arranged it was that everything on this wall was the most memorable, and everything on this wall was the most forgettable, with a bit of a mix in the back. And we did that because, you know, unlike the Art Institute where we have kind of no control and there's a bit of a mix of things in terms of memorability, we wanted to see, like, does a painting stay memorable if it's next to just all other really memorable artworks, and vice versa for the forgettable. And yeah, so we have, this is the structure of the experiment. Similar to the Art Institute one, it was a mobile Qualtrics study. There were 89 total artworks shown. 45 were targets from the gallery and 44 were foils. All of the foils were artworks that were submitted to the contest but didn't make it into the top 20. And this is, again, just the structure. Did you see this artwork? Definitely not to definitely yes, very straightforward. And we had a total of 106 participants during the month that the gallery was up. And we also took the gallery to a conference that I went to. It's called the Vision Sciences Society Conference in Florida. It's like the beach vacation conference. But basically we hosted a little pop-up exhibit because we wanted to see, like, if it would translate there as well, if the artworks are printed as opposed to being the actual artworks. And they have this big thing called demo night where, like, people look at all these visual illusions and stuff. And so from that, we were able to get another like 250 participants. So it'll be really interesting to see the difference between the gallery and this space. And yeah, so the kind of summary for all of these talks is that memory for artworks are significantly consistent and predictable both online and in person. Famous, large, and interesting paintings are more memorable, and center-oriented changes in blocking influence memorability the most. We found that, or we validated that low-level features, including color, unfortunately, have very little influence on an image's memorability, and that artists were able to successfully create memorable and forgettable artwork. Last thing is that formal art training does not support an artist's intuition for what is memorable. And with that said, the obligatory thank you to the lab, Wilma Bainbridge. She's been like super supportive throughout all this stuff, and it's just been like letting me go off and do whatever weird research thing I think of. And the lab is always helping me out with all the data stuff that I don't know how to do. And thank you for listening.
Did you see any like bumps in memory score for the ones that were near like the door of the changing rooms where people did the test?
So I still need to look at that. For the art contest stuff, we just have the preliminary findings from like the online submissions, but I haven't done anything yet with the actual in-person scores. I haven't even like had the chance to look at them yet. But we're gonna do like a whole set of analysis looking at like, are paintings by the changing room more memorable because, you know, you see them right before you take the test. Alternatively, I think people have actually said that they forgot them a lot. And I think it's because they're just so focused on like setting up the QR code and like getting ready to take the test. And they just have blinders on, which is really interesting. But a lot of people have like come out of the booths being like, okay, I killed it. Like I got every single one right. And then they're walking around like, oh, you know, and so far it seems like people are forgetting more of the ones on the forgettable wall and remembering basically everything on the memorable wall. But yeah, I'm really excited to really dive into that data, and I'll be doing that like all summer, basically. Yeah.
I do. Right, so mine was, like, what are the pros and cons of like ResMem incorporating prior knowledge, context, and expectations? Because you said it doesn't have any
Yeah.
like background to the cultural context,
Mhm.
etc. But like people do.
Yeah. I think at least how I see it is that it's really a pro because it, in theory, like tries to eliminate that human bias. Like, and that's what allows us to use it to look at things like famous paintings. So at least how I see it, it's a benefit. I've talked to like Cohen, the one who made it, about like basically how he could change it or how he could like improve it. And he basically said he could like take our art institute data from like those 4,000 paintings and basically make like an art resmem, which would be really cool. So I might like bug him about that this summer. But it can be, as far as I know, because he's like a computer science genius, a lot of ways that it can be adapted and changed to kind of suit different situations. So really just depending on what you're trying to accomplish, I know it's kind of a bad answer, but like it depends on what you want to look at. For us, it was really good to have it not know that context. But I imagine if you're like a company, like L'Oreal reached out to us about like giving a talk at whatever, and they wanted to make like the most memorable packaging. So for them, like I imagine having some context about like shampoo sales or whatever, like that may benefit them. But for us, we really have no interest in anything like that. So it really just depends on what your goals are, I guess.
I was gonna, oh,
You can go first.
I was gonna ask, do people use this stuff in advertising?
No, they're not allowed to. So ResMem, it's
Are
like,
you
it's
serious?
licensed to our lab. And so people like are able to use it for academic purposes and research, but like no companies are able to use it or anything. Even all of our like databases that we have like it's called the 50,000 faces database or image face database. And tons of people use it for research, but companies reach out all the time and it's my job to be like, sorry, no. So yeah, like no companies or anything are able to use anything that we use.
Just more out of curiosity, have you
Mhm.
found that any of this research has changed how you personally make art?
I get that question a lot. I try not to. I don't know, I always kind of hated the questions like later on in the visual arts major of like, oh, why do you make art, you know? Because I'm like, I don't know, like I just enjoy it, and I just try to make stuff that interests me. And so I don't really care if my work is more memorable or forgettable because like at least right now I'm making my work for myself as more of like a therapeutic process as opposed to like trying to sell. So if I were trying to sell work, then like maybe, but then again, we find that it doesn't impact decision making. So I don't personally. I know some other artists might, like even people who entered the forgettable contest. I asked like, well, why? And some of them were just like, that's just what I thought my style would be. Like they didn't necessarily try to make something forgettable, but they just thought that their work would be. So yeah, personally, I don't. Others may, but yeah.
Okay, my follow-up question based on
Mhm.
what you just said. Did you have, I know you said that you had people who tried to enter into the memorable category and they were forgettable. Did you have anybody enter into the forgettable category and it was actually more memorable than they were expecting?
Probably. I could.
I just
Do
wonder,
I have
because
the?
I'm like,
I
all the
don't have the
people who were
spreadsheet
like,
out right now, but I'm
Yeah,
sure there are.
yeah,
Yeah.
I just wonder, because all the people that were like,
Yeah.
no one will remember my work.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot more of the disappointment because there were just so many more people who entered the memorable contest that were
Yeah.
forgettable. So just by chance, there's gonna be more of that.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were a couple in there, but it was a lot more like upset emails than like, oh my God, yay, you know? Yeah.
I like how they're upset at you and it's like.
Yeah, it's like, I didn't do this, like, I just ran the experiment, I didn't choose.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
don't enter it into the competition.
You had a question in the back?
Oh.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's like memorability with faces.
Mhm.
How does that differ in the context of like art and also if there is a face in an art piece?
Yeah, we did look into that for the in-person paintings and the American Art Wing. We looked whether we basically marked every artwork where there was either a face, a body, both, or neither. And just with those artworks, we didn't see an impact of faces because everyone says like, oh, faces are memorable. And broadly speaking, for images, that is true. It still has to be like kind of teased apart for artworks. I also think part of the reason why we didn't see that in the American Art Wing stuff is because it's not the biggest sample size. Like there's 160 something artworks, but I'd say a lot more of them don't have people and are these very like traditional landscapes, or if there are people, they're like little ants, you know? So yeah, that's a great question. In general images, yes, it does have an impact. So far, we have not seen one for artwork, but I bet if we looked a lot closer, there would be something there.
Do you think it would be more for like faces in general or like attractiveness of the faces? Even though you said like
Yeah.
beauty isn't a component, I know that like for social cognition, we often like lean more towards like attractive.
Yeah, I think from studies about faces specifically, they did not see an impact with attractiveness.
You mentioned distinctiveness, right? was
Distinctiveness
that-
in terms of like identifying an object, not
Okay.
in terms of like compared to others. There's another lab on campus called the Todorov lab that's in like the econ department, so I don't really know them much. But they have this like generative model that basically changes an image of a face to like make it more memorable or more forgettable or more trustworthy or less trustworthy. And that has like tons of different like social and racial implications and stuff like that. And I think they got like a ton of like hate on Twitter because people were calling them racist, but they were like, we're pointing out that people are racist. You know, like it's a, you know, it's showing that, yes, you're right. Like it's exactly. Exactly. But yeah, so faces is just like a whole nother area with a whole ton of like implications that come along with it. But it's really interesting work as well. And they actually we asked them to have their generative art model submit to the contest because we basically fed it ResMem data and scores, and it produced what it thought that ResMem would find to be the most memorable and forgettable. So it's basically just these two networks kind of working together. Exactly. And so I think it placed in the top 20 for the forgettable artwork, but not for memorable. And it was like terribly obvious that it was AI. It was like, it was supposed to be a person kind of like this, but the hands, there were like 40 fingers. It's like, its neck was like twice the length of a normal one with like a necklace embedded in the neck. It was just like, it was terrible in every way. And it wasn't successful either, so. Exactly, yeah.
So I was gonna ask, I think you might have like briefly touched on this with the doorway effect, but I don't know if it's the same thing. So I was thinking, I guess, more like applying your neuroscience knowledge. If like our immediate surroundings or environment kind of affects the way that we produce our art and remember it. So I was thinking like, I don't know, say for instance, you were creating a piece of art like at a treatment facility or like art therapy, like, I don't know, compared to just completing art in a park with a loved one or something.
Yeah.
Like, is there any?
I honestly don't know how much of my like neuroscience knowledge would be able to answer that, but more of like anecdotal art evidence. Like, so as a part of the visual art major, you can do what's called the studio track, which let me like put stuff up in the gallery. And for that, we had our own studios for the year. I know at least for me, my art practice changed so much when I was able to just have a dedicated space for making art that wasn't like the desk across from my bed. You know, and so like my gut answer would be absolutely, I don't have anything to back that up. But I think there would be a big impact. And like next year I'll be doing a master's program, and it's basically like a psychology and neuroaesthetics program. And basically my research there will be looking to see how artwork in clinical settings like hospitals could actually impact people's ability to heal. Because you know,
so
if
yes.
yeah, that's
So
like
I'll
the next
ask you
step.
next year.
Yeah,
I'll ask you next year.
Because like I wonder if you have a really memorable image in, for example, like a hospital room or like ER room, whatever, would that kind of distract you and prevent you from remembering all the like chaotic shit that's going on in the hospital? Because everybody knows it's terrible. So how can like the memorability of an image or other psychological properties impact that process? That's what I'm really interested in because I'm pre-med too. I'm applying to med schools now. So I'm kind of trying to shift my research and everything in that direction. You were first, sorry.
I really went to the children's hospital, especially the one downtown where they have like, it's like a safari.
Yeah.
The entire, and
Yeah.
the kids really like it.
And it's like I've talked to a lot of doctors about this of like why, like I've just kind of intuitively you want to make a children's hospital more fun, but like why not the regular one too? Like I spoke to one pediatric surgeon who like, it's silly, they have this thing called the buzzy bee. And it's this little like thing where when you get a shot, the buzzy bee attaches on your arm and vibrates it so that you don't feel the shot at all. And they have that as like a general practice for like 6 and under, whatever. But it's like, why not adults? Like, I'm not too grown for the buzzy bee, you know? Like, if I'm not gonna feel the shot, then like, of course. So that's like a whole different area, but like, I absolutely think we should be bringing stuff that's in the children's hospital to the regular one as well. Like, why does it have to be boring and sad also? But yeah, you had a.
You can go ahead.
Oh, okay, mine's more of a comment. I just wanted to comment, as everyone knows, I like to, but the Cleveland Clinic actually has an exchange program with the Cleveland Museum of Art where they like routinely cycle out all of these like paintings they have in the hospital. So I'd be interesting to see like the outcome of your master's degree.
Yeah, I reached out to and will most likely be partnering with the master's is in London, but it's this organization called Paintings in Hospitals, and they do that same exact thing where they work with hospitals to rotate art throughout. And so I think like they basically already said yes to doing a collaboration, so I'll have access to their like entire database of artworks and then get to see the impact of their artworks in the hospital. But yeah, there's like so many organizations like that, and it's so cool. And even like Chicago, they have some type of agreement where there's the same thing, but they also have a program called like Art to Live With, where they literally let people in the dorms take art from the museum and hang it up. Like I had an original Miro print in my dorm room, which was very weird and cool. And like I don't know why they trust us. It's probably like just for the insurance money, to be honest. But yeah, that's super cool.
How do you see like this research applying to art therapy and memorability? Because we were talking about like in terms of healing just by like being in a room with it in a hospital.
Yeah.
But what about like actually like creating?
I don't know.
Yeah, that might be on a
Yeah, I
range.
like it's been really cool to hear the stories of people who entered the art contest because I was surprised to see so many people who already had that connection in their lives. Like the person who had the third most memorable piece, she is a like psych ward nurse who herself has a memory disorder and is an artist. And so like she, uses artwork to cope with her own memory disorder, but also as a way to kind of reflect on the things that she sees at work.
That is so.
Yeah, like someone who
That's
had.
empowering, honestly.
Yeah, like there was actually I don't know if I could find it on the spot, but there was like a disability advocacy group that all worked together to create an artwork for the contest. And I think I can, yeah. So they literally all worked together to create this piece for their submission. There was another person who had a history of like multiple traumatic brain injuries, and she said like she uses art to kind of like get her through daily life. And so it was just really fascinating to see like people's kind of pre-existing connections between like neuroscience, memory, and art, and like how that influenced their entry to the contest. But yeah.
How much does art like influence your research like beyond this project?
I mean, these are like my big three basically.
Okay.
I like the first couple I did during my time as an undergrad, and so obviously you only have so many hours to do research. But the art contest and like getting the whole gallery together in person, that was like my big thing as lab manager. Like I started that last June and it's now wrapping up. I'd say my art experience influences everything I do in my research. Like I studied neuroscience, not psychology, but I work in a psychology lab. And although like obviously neuro and psych are super similar in many ways, when it comes to the research side of things, not so much. Like I don't know neuroimaging, like, but I know how to like culture and stain cells in the lab and like know how to do all that like micro stuff. But when it comes to psych, I'm like, okay, like I like art, let me try to do this, and again, that's where I've been really grateful to have that support where Wilma's just like, go for it. I was really scared to do it at first because I didn't know how to code. I didn't know how to do anything. I still don't know how to code. I know how to code what I need to know, But yeah, my research and like what the questions that I ask in it are basically entirely driven by my experience as an artist.
And did you go into school like declaring one major before the other or both at the same time?
I debated that for a while. I started off, so the story that I like to tell is the advisor that I was assigned to, she had a very bad reputation of like changing people's majors and just being like, you aren't smart enough for this, da da da,
Hell no.
terrible in every way. So I wanted to keep my options open as like, and then I figured it's easier to drop a major than to add one. And so I walked into her office in our first meeting. I was like, I want to do neuroscience and visual arts, and I'm also a pre-med. Tell me how to do it. And she was just like, okay, you know. But yeah, so I just started with everything and thought if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. Like my pre-med advisors were like, yeah, if your GPA is taking a hit, just drop neuro and do art because med schools will like that better. But I just kind of stuck with it because I enjoyed it. And honestly, it was, I think like, I don't know, Chicago has a pretty bad rep in terms of like enjoying oneself. But I think that having the art major in addition to neuro really helped me and like allowed me to enjoy my time there because I was forced to paint, you know, like I had to sit in a 3-hour class and just paint and do whatever. And so I think having that requirement was really nice because otherwise I knew I would just like, oh, I don't have time. I have to do this. I have to do that. But like, if it's a class, then I have to do it, you know, and it just barely fit in the schedule. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite painting?
I do. It's how do I move this? It's Cow Skull with Calico Roses by Georgia O'Keeffe. Um, it's on the second floor of the American Art Wing in room 272. Because I had to go to the Art Institute a ton for my research, and just like every time I walked by it, I was like, damn, I like this one. I normally don't like landscapes. I find them incredibly boring, but I think there's just something about her work that's really, I don't know, I just really love it. Yeah, this is my favorite. I have a ton of other favorites. Like there was this one, I was in Japan in March, and there's like a cherry blossom art museum that I went to, and one of the artworks there was like this skeleton with like cherry blossoms draping over it, but it was this really cool mix of like transparency and light. And so that's like a very close number 2. So I like a lot of like skulls and type of stuff in my art.
Are you into abstract at all?
I've had a hard time with it, I think. I think it's because I don't enjoy the very like heady side of art. Where they're like, oh, it's about emergence. And I'm like, but is it though? You know, like, or are you just making that up to justify its price tag?
Yeah, for real.
So I'm not the biggest into abstract art. But also like purely representational stuff is a bit boring for me as well. I don't know, I'm still figuring it out. I think I'm very much still like exploring my own style as well.
You into like psychedelics at all? Give me such a migraine, honestly.
I like color, but I don't like a ton of different colors. Like I do a lot of monochromatic portraiture. My favorite color right now is called Payne's Gray. And it is the most like beautiful thing in the world because this is a bad picture of it, to be honest. This is more like it. It's like this very rich blue gray, but when this isn't doing it justice, but when you lighten it up, those like purpley tones emerge. And it's super beautiful. So I like a lot of monochromatic stuff, but not like red, green, blue, purple, like all in one thing. That's too much for me. Yeah.
Yeah, like using that gray for like shadows.
Yeah, it's really one of my painting professors, Catherine. She didn't let us use black, and that was like the best thing to ever happen to me because like it's that goes into like color theory and everything, but like she didn't let us use black, and that was like one of the best decisions ever, and it's like totally changed my understanding of color and light and everything. But yeah, it's a good color.
I've got a question kind of, I don't know if it's well formed, but I'm trying to sort of reconcile some of the like memorability as an intrinsic property, as an intrinsic feature in the context of sort of like forms of learning. So, it just seems so, and I haven't really thought about this at all, but just,
Uh-huh.
you know, kind of like, how do you, this seemingly kind of maybe, it seems like it's separate from, or can be divorced from kind of like more subjective, you know, takes on a piece, or, you know, things that you, like, this is something that's separate from, that's intrinsic to, separate from, and that you kind of have, that doesn't involve, obviously, like conscious recall or anything like that, or in theory, or certain, like, is this more of an implicit, you know, sort of feature, or I don't know what you can call it, but this is not gonna be affected by how much time you spend taking in a piece,
Yeah,
right? I mean, and people who look at a passing image for like a second or two, you're still getting the same scores whether or not you walk through.
yeah, and like
Right.
stare at it for half.
Yeah, right? So I'm just trying to reconcile sort of what you glean from this in the context of like memory
Yeah,
and forms of learning.
yeah. I mean, previous stuff has shown that memorability accounts for about 50% of like individuals' memory.
Yeah,
So obviously there's other stuff at play, but I guess see memorability as like the undercover agent of memory. It's like everything that you're not thinking about. And so like a lot of like applications of memorability are in like education.
okay.
So like
Yeah,
how
yeah.
could you design a slide that allows people to grasp the information better, like regardless of how well they're paying attention or how much they
Yeah,
care
yeah.
about the material. And like there's even someone in the lab, a PhD, who's doing a project about gestures
Yeah.
and how gestures impact memorability. She studied like water conservation, where like they literally work with like 4 or 5-year-olds and they pour like M&Ms from a wide cup to a tall cup, and they like see how using gestures when explaining that and like liquid conservation, like how that can actually improve their learning. And so the first step that they did was proving that including relevant gestures into learning
Yeah.
improves memorability. And now the next step is, well, does improving memorability actually improve
Yeah.
learning?
That's cool. Yeah, so that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've enjoyed a lot of the memorability research just because I don't like, honestly, like I'm not much of like a memory person. Like it's cool, but I'm much more in it for like using the stimulus and like looking at the artworks as opposed to like all the hippocampus track stuff, you know. But the like neural kind of theory for memorability is that things that are more intrinsically memorable are more easily processed, which at least to me makes sense. But
I don't think these papers explicitly talk about anything neuroscience related, unless I'm wrong, but like, how could you then further this project to incorporate neuroscience, like
yeah.
strategies, like with brain imaging?
Yeah. I guess like my dream setup would be to like have a cap on people as they walk through a gallery, you know, and like see
Yeah.
what's lighting up and when. There are a lot of like MRI studies that are going on right now about memorability, and we actually a lot of our work recently, because of a big grant we got, is about aphantasia, which if I tell you all to imagine a beach, almost all of you probably can see a beach in your head, but people with aphantasia can't. And so we're seeing how like the relationship between memorability and aphantasia, and if there's a link there. And like people with aphantasia tend to use a lot more semantically driven content to remember things. Like my first project in the lab was like basically using this like Sims like tool to like create faces, like you widen the mouth, you open the eyes, whatever. And we had someone with aphantasia take it and like you see a face and you have to replicate it. And she basically said like slanty eyebrows, thin lips, long nose, and just kept like repeating those until she did it. And then she was like, okay, I'm tapping out because anything else I do from here would be pointless. So yeah, like there's a lot of research into that and like how visual imagery as a whole relates to memorability. So there's like tons of different avenues. But yeah, for me, if I could just like have a walking MRI while people are looking at artworks, or even just have people look at artwork while in an MRI and see like if how artworks are processed is different from how traditional images are processed. Because they're different, you know. But I don't know if there would be, but yeah.
Is there, yeah, so, in terms of, you know, fMRI data, is there any kind of, like, I like imagine that you're looking, that you have likely regions that are kind of like, sort of temporal lobe, so, that ventral visual stream kind of processing stuff, right?
Yeah.
Is there any localization at all, or any kind of history localization, or is it multiple centers possibly that are involved?
It's a lot of centers interacting, but I think broadly, especially with MRI data, they look at how basically how far the information spreads to the frontal lobe
Yeah.
versus occipital, because memorability, at least from a lot of what we've seen, is more semantically driven, and that would be kind of farther forward, and not as reliant on just purely visual regions. So that's kind of the angle that a lot of MRI data looks at it.
Yeah.
We recently did a study with a pair of twins, identical twins, where one had aphantasia and the other didn't. And so it's well, what's different in their brains, They're still working on the analysis of that, and as far as I know, they're actually not coming up with much, which is weird because you would think that not being able to picture something in your head is such an important phenomenon,
I think a
but
lot of, I've had conversations with my friends about this. It's a question I just like to ask people for some reason. And I think a lot of people who can't visualize in their head don't necessarily know that other people can't visualize.
Oh, absolutely.
Like,
like,
I'm
yeah.
thinking
Yeah.
pictures,
I
but
have-
my husband thinks in words.
I'm the
Does that
same
make
way. I have
Yeah.
a really strong visual memory, and I talk with one of my friends because we both like to collage. And for her, it's so much
Yeah.
harder because she can't make a picture in her head of what she wants to do. She just kind of has to do it
Yeah.
until she likes it.
Yeah, I was talking to one of my friends who's also an artist about the lab's research, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I probably have that," and she just had no idea. And I've met other artists who have aphantasia, and
Yeah. And
when I watched her make art after I found that out, I was like, "Oh, she's always using a reference."
yeah, and
And
it's
it's
why
like-
she likes collaging. I've always been more into painting and
Yeah.
stuff. But for me, I would give myself a 9 out of 10 on visual imagery. But I asked her and she was a 3.
Yeah,
So she could visualize it, but she was it takes all of my brain power to do it.
yeah.
So I don't know. I always
Yeah.
think it's really interesting. It's
No,
one of those
it's-
random questions.
Just thinking about how they make art is crazy.
Yeah.
My freshman year roommate has no mental imagery at all. She's a biochem major. She says that it's really hard to study
Mm.
because you're imagining molecules essentially. She's like, I
Yeah.
can't picture it. Same with research. It's really hard for her to imagine what she's doing in
Yeah.
context. So I've never really thought about it. It makes sense in terms of art, but I never really thought about it in academic.
Yeah,
sense.
and even I know for I think what kind of carried me through the whole pre-med biochem, organic chemistry was being able to picture things. I think I see things pretty well in 3D in my head. And so I had this one of my favorite classes ever was a dissection class where we literally had a human brain, and over 10 weeks we worked to dissect it and see different structures. But when it came time to get to the hippocampus, which is inside, you have to be able to see it before you see it, And so I remember for me, it was pretty straightforward of knowing the depth to cut and all this and that. But I would look over and some people just had messes on their tables. I'm like, you're really doing that to a brain, But yeah, I'm sure it plays a role in tons of different areas.
Yeah, it's if I read a paper or think of anything involving my work, or just thinking about, cellular sort of mechanisms, and I immediately visualize everything. So I can't think about any concept tied to my research without literally seeing it. I see a spine, I see pre and post-synaptic context, I see structures of the actin filament. I see it all the time. And I can't not, right?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting because I visualize what's happening inside the cell, as I'm thinking about how a cell's getting stronger, how, a certain synapse get. And I see and it's been such a intrinsic part of just how I think about science, or how I, think, right, do experiments. I have to visualize it.
Mhm.
And it's impossible not to. And it's a very detailed 3D kind of, and that's interesting to me, the fact that, there are folks who don't do that.
It's crazy.
Yeah,
It's
it's really interesting. That's really cool. Any other questions? Comments? Fantastic.
guys.
Thank you so much, Trent. This is really great last presentation. I'm sure we'll have some good discussion on Thursday. I mean,